almost a full house for a talk on Dale Chihuly, sculpture in glass. And this is in conjunction with a special program of the art of Chihuly in conjunction with a performance by the Columbus Symphony of Bluebeard, the opera by Bartók, Bluebeard's Castle, in which, and this is a publicity shot for that performance that's going to take place on February 28th and 29th, in which these various works by Chihuly will represent doors that are opened by one of the characters in the opera in Bluebeard's mysterious castle. So it should be a riveting and very beautiful performance. And we will have the pleasure, after I conclude my remarks, of hearing an ensemble of musicians from the Columbus Symphony perform works by Hindemith and Turner. So to begin with Dale Chihuly, here you see him without his familiar eye patch. You see him in an early photograph from the 70s. And I'll get into the unfortunate accident, in a few minutes. He is a native of Washington. His undergraduate work was done at University of Washington, Seattle. And his degree as an undergraduate was in interior design, which he earned in 1965. In graduate school, he made the switch to glass and sculpture. He attended the University of Wisconsin in Madison and the RISD Museum, Rhode Island School of Design, where I worked for a number of years before coming here. And he received a master's in sculpture from RISD. He discovered glass blowing by accident while working with a kiln, working on a sculpture or a ceramic project. And he described it this way. One night in 1965, I melted a few pounds of stained glass in one of my kilns and dipped a steel pipe from the basement into it. I blew into the pipe and a bubble of gas appeared. I had never seen glass blowing before. My fascination for it probably comes in part from discovering the process that night by accident. From that moment, I became obsessed with learning all I could about glass. And indeed, he did. After his degree at RISD, he traveled to Venice, where he was able to observe glassmaking on the island of Murano, an island near Venice, and a glassmaking center, a renowned, world-famous glassmaking center since the Renaissance. And earlier, as an undergraduate, he actually took a year or so off from his undergraduate studies to travel in Europe and the Middle East, from whence he gathered a lot of inspiration in later years. So he returned to RISD and became a teacher there, setting up and teaching in a new glass program that he participated in for over a decade, and finally, eventually returned to the state of Washington. He set up the Pilchuck School of Glass that was in operation by the early 70s and is now the internationally renowned glassmaking studio and school. So what you see on the right, this vessel, Navajo blanket cylinder, one of his series from the 1970s based on Amerindian baskets and blankets. And here are more examples from that series. Before he turned to glassmaking, he had experimented with weaving glass fragments into tapestries, and hence his interest in not only the medium of glass itself, but other media that served as sources of inspiration. And this will be consistent to his career, that he brings to bear traditions of many cultures and many media into his glass creations or glass sculpture. And speaking of the difference between sculpture and glass objects. Traditionally, glass had been used for utilitarian purposes, in windows, for drinking cups, vessels, bottles, and so on. And actually, these are examples of potentially more utilitarian use of glass because they are cylinders, so they could be drinking cups, tumblers, and so on. They're empty vessels that could, in theory, be filled. Another thing about his the importance of his work, that he's a major part of the American studio art glass movement that began in the early 1960s, began in the Midwest, in places like Wisconsin and Toledo, Ohio. And that glass movement involved the importance of the individual designer or artist in creating works that were one-of-a-kind objects instead of a production in multiples. And here's another product from the 70s, although it bleeds into the 80s, 1979 to 80s, on the cusp of a new decade. And it bears the name of the Pilchuck School, the Pilchuck Basket Group. It's in the collection of Metropolitan Museum of Art, and virtually every major American art museum does have works by Chihuly. Many on view permanently, because as in the Columbus Museum of Art, they're on display in permanent installation spaces. And I'll talk about our work in a few minutes. But in this earlier stage, you see him still mimicking other craft forms, in particular baskets, which he magically transforms into glass. Now, so here you see him with the eye patch. That is a more familiar image of him. And so this goes back to an accident in the 70s. In 1976 in England, he was involved in a head-on car crash during which he was propelled through the windshield. So there were severe cuts to his face and the loss of sight in one eye. But he continued to blow glass after the accident until 3 years later, in 1979, when he dislocated his right shoulder while body surfing. So he turned misfortune into a new role in the glassmaking process. He became a director of the production that others in his studio actually executed. And the way he described it, he said he was more choreographer than dancer, more supervisor than participant, more director than actor. So it's in the 1980s that his more flamboyant works emerged, like the one you see on the screen, red and blue, a Persian set with onyx wrap. And part of that transformation has to do with his meeting of another glassmaker who I'm sure many, if not most or all of you are familiar with, Lino Tagliapietra, with whom he worked and interacted in the 1980s in Venice. And so there was a deepening of the influence on Chihuly's glass of the traditions of Venetian glassmakers, both earlier Renaissance, Baroque, 18th century, and more modern art movements that were reflected in Venetian glass. And Lino was so taken with Chihuly and American glass that he eventually will set up a studio in Seattle, so that he operates for now from both locations. So the richer color, the exuberant shapes, can be seen in this and other works from the 80s that I will show you. And this move towards a higher degree of decorativeness, richer color, more flamboyant shapes and forms was controversial at first. It was very postmodern, meaning that instead of a more iconoclastic or simplified, minimalist, pared down approach that would be characteristic of modernism. In postmodernism, which, depending upon how you look at it, begins in the late 70s and really blossoms in the 1980s, involves, among other things, borrowing or appropriating from historical sources and periods. Instead of artists trying to do something new that had never been seen before, that was unique, there was a reversal in embracing the past and using it in new and creative ways. So the historical styles to which Chihuly turns include Art Nouveau and Art Deco. Art Nouveau, a turn-of-the-century style based on the whiplash curve, a very decorative movement, and Art Deco, which is more related to geometric shapes and streamlined forms. But both of these, either turn-of-the-century or early 20th century movements, as well as older 18th century styles like the Rococo, very decorative, aristocratic, highly embellished 18th century style, these all come to play. And these works do, in the 80s, increasingly, he has numbers of different series, including this so-called Persian series. He began a Venetian series in 1988, which obviously directly acknowledges the influence of Venetian glassmaking. There's a Seaforms series that begins in 1980 that involves curly linear strands of glass. And this is the second example of the Persian series. This example is from the Persian series as well, from the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. And this is in the Seattle Art Museum, blue-stemmed form with orange and red Persians. And this form, or the forms in this work, suggest aquatic creatures, blue water, rocks along coastlines of the ocean. And it borrows, the word Persian refers, of course, to Persia, the old name for what is now Iran. And he was particularly taken by Islamic glass from the 12th to the 14th centuries. And you see this tension between abstraction and representation in his works. You're looking at something, and it's not exactly clear what he's representing. If this is an aquatic sea creature, for example, a form like this, it's not clear just what sea creature it is, or maybe it's a flower or a hybrid of the two. And other forms are so abstract that it would be hard to pin it down. Does this represent water or a rock or some kind of aquatic life? And that tension between the representational and the abstract is also a part of Islamic art, with the prohibition in certain cases in Islamic art from representing the human figure or representation at all. The Islamic artists through the ages developed these exquisite an exquisite aesthetic based on abstraction and line and color and pattern that is part of the aesthetic that you see in Chihuly's work. Now, here's another series. It's called the Macchia series. And if you've been coming to these Mozart to Matisse lectures for a while, you might remember a lecture that I gave on the Macchiaiuoli, which are the Italian Impressionists. And that comes from the word macchia, meaning spot in Italian. And just as the Italian Impressionists worked with so-called spots of paint or individual brushstrokes, the word for this series, macchia, refers to spots of color, brightly colored speckles or spots with a full range of colors, as many colors as possible that were in the studio of Chihuly that could be applied to works of glass like this. Now, the 1990s, through the decades, the scale of Chihuly's works increases. And he begins in 1991. Here's a photograph of the artist and his assistant working on piece from the Nimgia float series, and I apologize for not pronouncing, I'm sure I didn't pronounce that correctly, Nijimia, Nijima. I think Nijima is best. And I'm winging it, so I should have done a little more research on that, but it's Niijima. And it refers to an island in the Bay of Tokyo in which these floating balls are used by fishermen. And so these balls, and here you see a work that has many of these spherical shapes, and then one very large example that's being produced. He also saw these fishing floats, as they're sometimes called, in Puget Bay, or Puget Sound, when he was growing up. And the scale, of course, is impressive. These are some of the largest pieces of glass ever blown by hand. So the technical virtuosity of the works by Chihuly are often spoken of and appropriately noted. Here is another typical form that he develops increasingly in the 90s, the hanging chandelier, another example of the extravagant scale. These are colorful, organic, curled forms that are suspended. And this is what I mean by certain museums having works by Chihuly that never or rarely go into storage because they're part of the public spaces. So here's the wine chandelier in the St. Louis Art Museum. And again, wine because of the color, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this represents grapes and vine leaves, but could suggest any number of organic forms. Here's something that's a little less ambiguous in terms of what it's meant to represent. It's called Sunburst, and it's suspended from the ceiling of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts from 1999. And sometimes it seems everywhere you go, you see something by Chihuly. So I was in the Cincinnati Art Museum last week and had to snap a picture of their hanging chandelier, Rio della Torreselle chandelier from 1995 that hangs over the admission desk in the lobby at the entrance to the museum. And a detail on the right shows what another example of the exquisite technical virtuosity of the blown glass in a work like this. And finally, our own Isola di San Giacomo in Palude. It's that long Italian title. This is from 1996. And rather than being suspended, it's similar in form and shape to the chandeliers, but it's supported with a rod planted on a pedestal. And I often compare these. I probably should have brought a slide, but you're familiar, aren't you, with mobiles by Calder, Alexander Calder. You hang mobiles over babies' cribs, but they were developed as a fine art form by Alexander Calder, so suspended shapes that move with air currents. And Calder also developed stabiles, as opposed to the mobile, suspended very light in weight, heavy steel constructions that rest on the ground. And so I compare I think somewhat appropriately, the difference between suspended chandeliers of Chihuly and this work that's supported on a solid base and rises from the ground. So this Italian place name, the Isola di San Giacomo in Palude, is an island in the Venetian lagoon. Here's a picture of it that was home to a community of monks and friars for centuries, but more recently it's been used as a military base. It was abandoned in the 1970s and has since fallen into disrepair. But this is the place name that, for whatever reason, and it might have simply been random, that the artist gave to this work. And it brings to mind, as the other examples that I've shown of similar looking works, aquatic life forms, jellyfish, snakes, seaweed, The colors, the yellows, the reds, the blues evoke sunshine, water, sea creatures, plants, and the like. It came into the museum as a kind of, well, I shouldn't say apology, but a consolation, because Chihuly was contracted to appear at an event or a program, and he couldn't make it because he got another invitation that he really couldn't refuse to appear at a function with President Clinton. And so he, feeling bad about that, he offered this work to the museum, not as an outright gift, but at a very, very low price. So it was practically, we often call these gift purchases. So we are the lucky recipients. And by the way, this is also called part of an end of the day work that refers to a practice at the end of the day in the Venetian glass factory or the factory in Murano, putting all the pieces together that had been used during the day in other works in one last single piece. In other words, it's made of scraps, but are inspired by that kind of work. Something like a crazy quilt, putting together what's left over and what's at hand and creating a very colorful, exuberant work. And all told, it consists of 322 pieces of blown glass that were taken from other chandeliers in the studio. Now, there are also wall hangings by Chihuly. So you talked about suspended three-dimensional glass forms, glass on a pedestal. And so when the glass forms are hung on a wall or fixed to a wall, you might say that it's similar to relief sculpture. If you think of sculpture that's carved or cast that's on a flat wall but protrudes three-dimensionally, it's similar to something that you're seeing now on the screen. And just one more example, I wanted to show some works by Chihuly in other Ohio institutions. This is from the Cleveland Museum of Art, and another example from his Persian series that I explained goes back to the 80s, but these series continue through the decades. Another example of evocative, rich color. It's called cadmium yellow, with this hypnotic pattern bursting with visual energy. And then in the 2000s, increasingly, we see the production of large installation pieces. He'd done installations or rooms full of glass earlier, but there seemed to be more and more of them in the 2000s. And then something like this on the left. I've never been to the Tahoma Museum of Glass, but this is on my bucket list. I really would love to see this museum and the so-called bridge of glass on which two Chihuly towers were erected. This is one of two matching towers. These have been nicknamed Blue Rocks or Blue Ice. And the motivation behind this was, in Chihuly's own words, I really wanted to create something that people could see and that would welcome people to Tacoma, to complement or kind of provide a gateway to this museum that was completed in 2002. Now, these towers, or this tower in particular, was made of a polyurethane material called polyvitro, that's transparent but lighter in weight than glass. So even though this doesn't look very stable, and that adds to the dynamism of the work, will it topple over? But it's actually very stable and compelling. It's 43 feet high, and there are 63 crystals, if you count each of these shapes or forms. There are 63 of them in each tower. And then on the right, showing the full range of his output, you see examples of smaller, more restrained, classically inspired objects that are still, or that find their inspiration in the Venetian past. And I mentioned an Art Deco influence, but I didn't really show very good examples of it. But this would be, in terms of the symmetry, the relative restraint, and the style of ornamentation that's vaguely adapted from classical forms, a good example of Art Deco that also looks modern and streamlined. Now, I can't conclude without saying a few words about some of the other glass artists that are represented in the collection or will be represented in exhibitions. Speaking of which, there's an exhibition right now that you may have seen. Has anybody been up to the second floor of the Walter Wing to see the exhibition of work by Lino Talia Pietra, Masterworks in Glass? Raise your hand if you've seen it. So some, oh good. So I'm glad that a lot have seen it, but some haven't. So I think you'd enjoy, if you like the work of Chihuly, an important collaborator of Chihuly from Venice. And as I said, Lino Talia Pietra also has a studio in Seattle, and he's the artist. Everybody, you have to have seen the most prominent work by Lino in the exhibition that's always hanging, suspended from the ceiling of the atrium, called Embark. And this is an example of half a dozen works by Lino that are in the permanent collection of the Columbus Museum of Art. And here are some installation shots of works, relief or a wall hanging at the entrance to the exhibition, and then within the gallery itself, you'll see all of the works by Lino that are in the permanent collection, as well as I think there are 9 or 10 others from private collections in the greater Columbus area. And this will be up until July 5th, so there's lots of time to still see it. And then, how many have seen the work on the left, Sunflower? It's in Gallery 2. It's in the historic building, and it's one of the favorite works. This is by a Columbus-born glassmaker, a product of, or he did his academic work at Ohio State University. I guess it is the Ohio State University, and received his master's at University of Wisconsin, and has worked with optical glass, very expensive and very unique kind of glass with a remarkable clarity that has allowed him to create works like this Sunflower on the left. And he is probably the most famous glassmaker to come out of Columbus. The Sunflower is on long-term loan to the museum, and we are hoping, it's not certain, but we're hoping to acquire it for the permanent collection. And so people will, it's one of the most popular works in the museum at this point, and so we're really hoping to be able to add it to the collection. And then some of the other works by the artists that are in the permanent collection by Christopher Reese, I have on the screen as well. We recently added a work by Martin Blank, who is another student, or was a student of Chihuly at RISD. And he's taught at Pilchuck. He has a studio in Seattle, Martin Blank. He's noted for what you see on the screen, this work called Convergence, with the natural forms, somewhat anthropomorphic. They suggest human forms when looked at in a certain way, but it's more about, as the artist puts it, carving space, and very much of the Art Nouveau aesthetic in terms of the curvilinearity. And this is a recent gift of Robert and Rachel Stern, for which we're very grateful. And that's on the second floor of the Walter Wing. If you look out the north window at the top of the staircase and move north, look out over the garden, and there it is. And then finally, we have an exhibition coming up. We still have to fix the date. It might be 2021, 22. An exhibition of work by Dan Daly, another student of Chihuly at RISD, lives in New Hampshire, who works in a more figurative way, representational forms, human forms, Seaforms, a pistachio lamp, and these forms can be contemporary or historical. For example, the base on the right has connections with classical ancient art, and some of his works are utilitarian, others are more what we would think of as a sculpture in glass. And I must show as my final slides a reminder of the installation that's at the Franklin Park Conservatory and Botanical Gardens, a special program of or installation of works by Chihuly that will be up until, and I'm going to move over here, March 29th. It's been up since the past fall. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, I would just recommend Googling Franklin Park Conservatory, and you will see this screen and can get more information. And so now it gives me great pleasure, and I am honored to turn over the stage to the musicians from the Columbus Symphony Orchestra who will perform for you 2 works. Thanks very much for listening, for coming, and enjoy the music.